4 lights burning in the chandelier in the dining room, wreaths of blue smoke, the glass doors onto the veranda hidden behind cream-coloured curtains. The clocks are inaudible, fresh vases of hothouse roses against the whiteness of the tablecloth, 3 bottles of vodka and some slender bottles of German white wine, Lafitte wineglasses, apples in gleaming cut-glass vases, slices of lemon, crumbs all over the table, tea. A crumpled page from the humorous newspaper, The Devil's Plaything, on an armchair. Minds clouded by the fog of uncertainty, with thoughts now rising to sunlit uplands of irrational joy, now plunging into dark valleys of anxiety. Random sentences and snippets of nonsense verse floated around in the fog. Best not sit on a hedgehog without any clothes. Load of old nonsense, but at least the guns have stopped. What a laugh, damn it. Vodka, vodka, my mind's gone blank. Come on, how about a twang on the guitar? No point in baking melons on a bar of soap. The Americans have won, so don't lose hope. Hidden behind a wall of smoke, Mikhail, now quite drunk, roared with laughter. Brightman's wit is pretty good, as everyone knows, but where are the Senegalese, do you suppose? Yes, right. Where are they? Where are they? Asked Mikhail, slurring his words. Sheep give birth when they're in a tent, and Rodzianko'll be our president. But they're talented, those bastards. You have to give them that. Presiding over all of this was Yelena, sitting in an armchair at the narrow end of the table. Since Talberg's departure, she had not been allowed to have a moment to herself, and white wine does not take the pain away completely. It merely blunts it. Opposite her, at the other end of the table, sat Mikhail in a dressing gown, unshaven, white-faced, covered in blotches from the vodka and devastating fatigue. His eyes were ringed with red from the extreme cold, the shock of events, the vodka and anger. Alexei and Nikolka were sitting along one side of the table. Opposite them sat Leonid Yuryevich Shavinsky, former hussar lieutenant in the Life Guards and now adjutant on the headquarters staff of Prince Belorukov. Next to him was Second Lieutenant Fyodor Nikolaevich Stepanov of the artillery, universally known since his grammar school days as Karas, or Carp. Karas, small, compact, and indeed looking extraordinarily like a carp, had bumped into Shavinsky right at the entrance to the Turbins some 20 minutes after Talberg had left. Both turned out to have bottles on them. Shavinsky a package of 4 bottles of white wine, Karas 2 bottles of vodka. In addition, Shavinsky was laden with the largest imaginable bouquet of flowers hidden in 3 layers of wrapping paper. Roses, for Yelena Vasilievna, of course. Standing by the entrance, Karas lost no time in telling Shavinsky about the gold artillery insignia on his epaulets. He had run out of patience, he said. Everybody would be needed to go and fight. In any case, what they had been taught at college would be irrelevant, particularly if Petlura were to enter the city. Everybody had a duty to fight, and all artillerymen had to join the mortar battalion. The commanding officer was Colonel Malishev, and the battalion itself was a remarkable one, full of students from his college. But the fact that Mikhail had gone off to join that idiotic detachment filled him with despair. Goodness knows where he was now. He'd probably gone and got himself killed somewhere near the city. But when they got upstairs, who should be there but Mikhail? In the semi-gloom of her bedroom, golden Yelena hastily powdered her face in the oval, silver-leafed mirror and went out to receive the roses. Wonderful! Everybody was there. Compared with Shavinsky's pale-coloured cavalry epaulets and immaculately pressed blue breeches, Karas's crumpled artillery insignia looked far less resplendent. Shavinsky's eyes danced with malicious glee when he was told about Talberg's disappearance. The little hussar immediately sensed that he was in exceptionally fine voice, and in the pink glow of the lamplight, the sitting-room became filled with an overwhelming cascade of sound as he sang a hymn of praise to the god of marriage. He sang with such power and passion that you might be forgiven for thinking that a voice such as Shavinsky's was the only thing on earth that made any sense. For the time being, of course, there was his staff job and this idiotic war, and besides, the Bolsheviks and Petlura had to be confronted as well, not to mention his duty. But afterwards, when everything had returned to normal, despite his St. Petersburg connections, and what connections they were, too, he would give up his military career and go on the stage. He would sing at La Scala and at the Bolshoi in Moscow, while the Bolsheviks were being hanged on lampposts on Theatre Square. When in Zhmerinka he had sung an A rather than an F during a rendition of the Epithalamium, Countess Lendrikova had fallen in love with him, and he had held the A for 5 bars. At this, Chervinsky hung his head a little and looked round the room as if he had been telling someone else's story rather than his own. "That's right, for 5 bars. All right, let's go and eat." And so the wreaths of cigarette smoke. "Well, where are the Senegalese troops, then? Come on, staff officer, let's have an answer. Lenotchka, my beautiful golden girl, have some more wine. Everything will work out. Leaving when he did was the best thing he could have done. He'll make his way to the Don, and then he'll be back here with Denikin's army." "They'll come," boomed Chervinsky. "They'll come, I'm certain of it. And now, if I may, some important news. I saw Serbian billet officers today on the Krещatik. The day after tomorrow, in 2 days' time at the latest, 2 Serbian regiments will be arriving in the city." "Really? Is that true?" Chervinsky frowned. That's a little strange. If I say I saw it, then such a question seems out of place." "2 regiments, you say? 2 regiments?" "All right, then, be so kind as to listen to this. The prince himself told me today that troop transports with Greeks and 2 divisions of Senegalese on board are already being unloaded in Odessa. We just need to hold out for 1 more week, and then we can tell the Germans to go to hell." "Traitors!" "Well, if all that's true, then we'll catch Petliura and string him up. String him up. I'll shoot him myself. Another drop, gentlemen. Your good health." Suddenly, the fog takes over completely. Fog, ladies and gentlemen. Having drunk 3 glasses of wine, Nikolka dashed to his room for a handkerchief. Running through the hallway, he crashed against the coat stand. You can always be yourself when you know no one's watching. Chervinsky's curved sabre, with its gleaming gold hilt, the gift of some Persian prince, a Damascene sword. Actually, it hadn't been a gift from a prince, and the sword wasn't from Damascus, although it was certainly an expensive and fine-looking blade. A grim-looking Mauser on a strap in its holster. Karas's Steyr automatic pistol, with its burnished muzzle. Nikolka grasped covetously at the cold wooden holster, and running his fingers over the Mauser's lethal barrel, almost wept from excitement. He wanted to leave immediately and fight in the snow-covered fields around Postvolinsky. He felt ashamed and awkward. Here he was in a warm room with plenty of vodka, but out there it was dark, a blizzard was blowing, and the cadets were freezing to death. What were those staff officers thinking of? The unit was unprepared, the students untrained, and the Senegalese still hadn't come. Almost certainly as black as boots, they'd freeze to death here, wouldn't they, for heaven's sake? They were used to a warm climate, weren't they? "Well, I'd string up your hetman first," shouted Alexei. "For the last 6 months he's just been laughing at all of us. Who was it against the idea of a Russian army being formed? The hetman. And now, when things have got really bad and the enemy is at the gates, they've started to form a Russian army. But it's simply staff officers and a few independent units. What do you think of that, eh?" "You're just panic-mongering." "Me? Panic-mongering? Why do you simply refuse to understand me? I'm not panic-mongering at all. I just want to get everything that's been boiling up inside me off my chest. Panic-mongering. Don't worry, I've already decided to go to that battalion tomorrow, and if your Malishev doesn't want to take me as a doctor, then I'll enlist as an ordinary private. I'm so fed up with all this. I'm not panicking." A piece of cucumber stuck in Alexei's throat, and he started coughing and choking. Nikolka began to thump him on the back. "Right," agreed Karas, banging the table. "Private, you say? Nonsense. We'll get you in as a doctor." "We'll all go tomorrow, together," Mishlaevsky mumbled drunkenly. "All of us, together. The entire Alexandrovsky Imperial High School. Hurrah!" "He's an absolute swine," Alexei continued scathingly. "He doesn't even speak our language. What do you think of that? 2 days ago, I was talking to that swine Dr. Kuritsky. Apparently, since last November, he's forgotten how to speak Russian. He's even changed his surname so that it's Ukrainian rather than Russian. Anyway, when I ask him what cat is in Ukrainian, he replies kit. But since kit means whale in Russian, I ask him what whale is in Ukrainian. He pauses, stares at me for a moment and says nothing, and now he won't even acknowledge me. Nikolka roared with laughter. It's not at all surprising there isn't a word for whale, because they don't have them in the Ukraine, whereas Russia has masses of them, in the White Sea, for example. As for mobilization, Alexei continued venomously, it's a pity you didn't see what was going on in the police stations yesterday. Every one of those currency speculators knew about the order to mobilize 3 days before it was given. How about that? And they all either had a hernia or some patch on their lung, or they'd simply vanished into thin air. And that, my friends, is a very ominous sign. If you have people gossiping in the coffee houses just before mobilization is announced, and then nobody joins up, things are in a very bad way. The bastards. The absolute bastards. If only he'd started forming the officer corps in April, we would have taken Moscow by now. You realize he could have formed an army of 50,000 men. And what an army, eh? Picked troops, the very best, as they would all have been officers and cadets, graduates from the training school. There are thousands of such people in the city, and all of them would have joined up with enthusiasm. Not only would we have annihilated Petliura here, but we would have squashed Trotsky like a fly in Moscow. And precisely now would have been the right time to attack. They say they've started eating cats there. The hetman would have saved Russia. The son of a bitch. Alexei's face was covered in red blotches, and the words were gushing out of his mouth, accompanied by thin streams of saliva. "Listen to you. You should have been Minister of Defence rather than a doctor," said Karas. He smiled ironically, but he had liked and been inspired by what Turbin had said. "Alexei's your man at any meeting," said Nikolka. "He's an orator." "Nikolka, I've told you more than once that your so-called witticisms are not very funny," Alexei said. "Have some more wine instead." "But you realize that the Germans wouldn't allow an army to be formed," said Karas. "They'd be afraid of it." "That's not true," Alexei exclaimed in a thin voice. "It just needed someone with a head on his shoulders to come to some sort of an arrangement with the hetman, and then it would only have been necessary to explain to the Germans that we weren't any threat to them. It's over. We've lost the war. But we are faced with something else, something that's even more terrible than war or anything else. Trotsky. This is what we should have said to the Germans. You need sugar and bread, don't you? All right. Take whatever you need to feed your troops. Exploit us if you want, but help us and let us form an army. You must know that it will be to your own benefit. We'll help you keep order in the Ukraine to ensure that our Ukrainian holy men don't get infected with the Moscow disease. And with a Russian army in the city, we'd be protected from Moscow by a wall of steel. And as for Petliura, Turbin drew his finger across his throat and broke into a violent coughing fit. "Hold on a moment," said Chavinsky, standing up. "I've got to speak up in the hetman's defence. There have been mistakes, it's true, but his plan was a sound one. He's a diplomat, all right. First a Ukrainian state, to be sure, but then he would have done exactly as you've been saying. There would have been a Russian army, no argument about it. How do you like that?" Chavinsky gestured solemnly in the vague direction of the city. "The Russian tricolour is already flying on Vladimirskaya Street." "They've taken their time about it." "Yes, it is a bit late, it's true, but the prince is sure the mistake can be corrected." "Well, I hope to God he's right." Alexei turned to the icon of the Virgin Mary in the corner and crossed himself. "The plan was as follows," Chavinsky declaimed solemnly. "As soon as the war was over, the Germans would have reorganized in order to assist us in the struggle against the Bolsheviks. And then, once Moscow was occupied, the hetman would have laid the Ukraine at the feet of His Imperial Majesty Tsar Nikolai Alexandrovich." This utterance was met by the silence of the grave. Nikolka's face turned pale from grief. "The Tsar is dead," he whispered. "What? You mean Nikolai Alexandrovich?" Alexei asked, stunned, while Myshlaevsky, reeling from the news, looked askance at his neighbour's glass. Chervinsky had clearly had too much to drink, and was now too drunk to talk any sense. Yelena, her head in her hands, looked up at the hussar officer in horror. But in actual fact, Chervinsky wasn't particularly drunk. He raised his hand and said in a stentorian voice, "Not so fast. Just listen. But I would ask you, gentlemen, to keep what I am about to say entirely to yourselves." Nikolka went red in the face. Then he turned pale again. "All right, then. Do you know what happened when the hetman and his entourage were presented to Kaiser Wilhelm?" "Not the faintest idea," Karas said, his interest quickening. "Well, I know what happened." "Psh, yes, of course he knows everything," mocked Myshlaevsky. "You should just—" "Gentlemen, let him speak." After the Kaiser had graciously spoken to the hetman and his suite, he said, "I will bid you farewell, gentlemen, and now here's someone to talk to you about the future." The curtain across the door swished back, and our emperor walked into the room. "Gentlemen," he said, "go to the Ukraine and mobilize your regiments. As soon as the moment arrives, I will personally lead our army into the heart of Russia, into Moscow." And as he said that, his eyes filled with tears. His eyes shining, Chervinsky looked round at the assembled company, downed a whole glass of wine at one gulp, and grimaced. 5 pairs of eyes stared back at him. No one made a sound until he had sat down and started eating a piece of ham. "Yes, but that's just a fabrication," said Alexei, screwing his eyes up from the pain of it all. "I've heard it before." "They were all killed," Myshlaevsky said. "The Tsar, the Tsarina, and the Tsarevich." Chervinsky glanced at the stove, took a deep breath, and said, "If you believe that, you're wrong. The news of His Imperial Majesty's death is somewhat exaggerated," interrupted Myshlaevsky with a drunken attempt at a witticism. Yelena, trembling with indignation, rose above the haze of smoke. "You should be ashamed of yourself, Vitya. You're an officer." Myshlaevsky ducked back into the haze. "The news of His Imperial Majesty's death is a lie, dreamt up by the Bolsheviks themselves. The Tsar managed to escape with the help of his loyal tutor— sorry, I meant to say his son's tutor, Monsieur Gilliard, and a group of officers who spirited him away to, Asia. From there, they made their way to Singapore, and then by sea to Europe. And now the Tsar is the guest of Kaiser Wilhelm." "But they've got rid of him too, haven't they?" Karas interposed. "They are both the guests of Denmark, and with them is Her Most August Majesty, the Dowager Empress, Maria Fyodorovna, and if you don't believe me, you should know that I heard all this from the prince himself." Torn in two by what he had heard, Nikolka groaned inwardly. He wanted to believe it so much. "If that's the case," he said solemnly, suddenly jumping up and wiping the sweat from his brow, "I would like to propose a toast to the health of His Imperial Majesty." His glass flashed, and the golden arrows on its cut-glass side pierced the white German wine. Spurs clattered against the chairs. Myshlaevsky stood up, swaying and clutching at the table. Yelena too stood up. The golden crescent of her hair had fallen loose and now hung over her temples. "Even if he is dead, I don't mind," she shouted hoarsely, her voice cracking. "So what? I'll drink to him all the same." "He will never be forgiven for abdicating no, never. All the same, bitter experience has taught us that only the monarchy is capable of saving Russia. So even if the Tsar really is dead, long live the Tsar!" shouted Alexei, raising his glass. "Hurrah! Hurrah! Hurrah!" The dining room resounded with cheers. Down below, Vasilisa leapt up in a cold sweat. Still half asleep, he let out a blood-curdling yell and woke Vanda Mikhailovna. My God! Vanda mumbled, clutching at his nightshirt. "What on earth's going on? It's 3 o'clock!" Vasilisa shouted, weeping, addressing the blackened ceiling. "That's it! I shall certainly complain!" Vanda started to whimper. Suddenly, they both froze. A massive, oily wave of sound crashed down on them through the ceiling. Riding the crest of the wave was a rich, powerful baritone voice, ringing out like a bell. "Almighty, all-powerful, reign over us." Vasilisa's heart missed a beat, and even his feet broke into an excessive sweat. Speaking as if through cotton wool, he muttered, "No, that's too much. They've gone out of their minds. They could cause us so much trouble we'd never get out of it. Everyone knows the national anthem's forbidden. My God, what do they think they're doing? It could be heard outside, for goodness sake." But Vanda had already collapsed like a stone into sleep again. Vasilisa himself lay down again only when the final chord, accompanied by muffled shouts and cries, had died away. "Russia can be sustained by only two things, the Orthodox faith and autocracy," shouted Myshlaevsky, swaying unsteadily. "That's right." "A week ago I was at a performance of Paul I," Myshlaevsky mumbled, slurring his words, "and when the actor declaimed those words, I could not stop myself shouting out my approval. And what do you think? There was applause all round the theatre, except for some swine or other in the upper circle who yelled out, 'Idiot!' "Yids!" shouted Karas darkly, also the worse for drink. Fog, fog everywhere. Tonk, tank, tonk, tank. Senseless to have any more vodka or wine. Hearts are full to overflowing, can take no more. In the narrow little lavatory, the lamp leapt and danced about on the ceiling as if bewitched. Everything became blurred as the room spun round and round. With a pale and tortured expression, Myshlaevsky was violently sick. He was supported by an equally drunk Alexei, looking terrible, his cheeks twitching, his wet hair plastered to his forehead. "Ugh!" Myshlaevsky finally leant back from the bowl with a groan, and, struggling painfully to focus on his surroundings, clung to Alexei like an empty sack. "Nikolka!" somebody called out through the haze and the dark streaks. It took a few moments for Alexei to realize that it was his own voice he had heard. "Nikolka!" he called out again. The white lavatory wall swayed and turned green. "My God, how disgusting! How revolting! I swear I'll never again mix vodka with wine. Ah!" groaned Myshlaevsky hoarsely, slumping onto the floor. A black gap widened to reveal Nikolka's head and chevron. "Nikol, help me. Take him by the arm." Nikolka made sympathetic noises, and, shaking his head, reached laboriously down to help. The body, more dead than alive, slithered around in every direction, the legs jerking about like a puppet on a string, the head lolling inertly on the shoulders. Tonk, tank. The clock jumped off the wall and leapt back again. The flowers danced around in their vases. Yelena's face was blotched, a lock of hair bouncing over her right eyebrow. "Right, put him to bed." "You could at least get him into a dressing gown. It's not very nice for me, with him in that state. You damned idiots, you're hopeless when you drink. Vitka, what's wrong? Leave him, Nikolusha. It's no use. Listen, in the cupboard in my room on the shelf you'll find a little bottle marked liquor ammonia. You'll see it. One of the corners of the label is torn. Smells of ammonia." "Right, I'll get it straight away." "Look at you, and you're a doctor, too." Yes, all right." "What, isn't there any pulse?" "No, it's nothing. He'll get over it. Basin, quickly. Here you are." "Oh, look at you." There was a sudden reek of ammonia. Karas and Yelena held Myshlaevsky's mouth open, while Nikolka supported him, and Alexei twice poured the cloudy white liquid down his throat. "Get some snow. Snow! Christ almighty! Have to do it like this, though." The liquid dripped down from the damp rag covering his forehead. Below the rag, the bloodshot whites of his eyes could be seen rolling around under half-closed eyelids, and his sharp nose was marked by bluish shadows. Jostling each other, the three of them busied themselves over the stricken officer for a quarter of an hour until he opened his eyes. "Go away!" he croaked. "Oh, all right. Let him sleep here." Lights shone in every room as they bustled about the apartment making beds. "Leonid Yuryevich, you can sleep here next to Nikolka." "Right." Chervinsky, his face a copper-red colour, but still cheerful, bowed, showing his parting. Yelena's white hands fluttered over the pillows on the settee. "You don't need to do that. Let me." "Go away. Why are you tugging at that pillow? I don't need your help." Allow me to kiss your hand.
What for?
To thank you for all your trouble.
It can wait. Nikolka, are you in bed? How is he? Not too bad. He's on the mend. He'll sleep it off.
In the room leading to Nikolka's, 2 beds had been made up behind 2 bookcases that had been pulled close together. Both bookcases were full of books. This was the room known in the professor's family as the library. In the library, in Nikolka's room and in the dining room, the lights had gone out. From Yelena's bedroom, a dark red patch of light crept out through the narrow gap in the dining room door. Finding the light tiring, Yelena had thrown a dark red theatre bonnet over the lamp on the bedside table. At one time, she used to go to the theatre wearing this bonnet, her arms, furs and lips smelling pleasantly of perfume, and her face delicately powdered. She looked out at the world from under this bonnet like Liza from the Queen of Spades. But in the course of the past year, the bonnet had rapidly become strangely tatty. The folds had shrunk and faded, and it had lost its ribbons. And, like Liza from the Queen of Spades, golden-haired Yelena sat on the bed in her housecoat, ready for sleep, her hands on her knees, and her bare feet buried in the ancient, worn bearskin rug. Her brief spell of intoxication had completely gone, and her head was enveloped as if by a bonnet of dark, overwhelming grief. From the next room, muffled by the cupboard that had been placed against the door, she could hear Nikolka's gentle whistling and Chervinsky's loud, hearty snoring. From the library, where Karas and the poleaxed Mishlaevsky lay asleep, there was silence. Alone in her room, in the dark red lamplight shining through the bonnet, and the windows forming 2 black holes in the wall, Yelena felt uninhibited, able to talk to herself, now silently and now in an undertone, hardly moving her lips. "He's gone." Musing and muttering to herself, she screwed up her dry eyes. She couldn't understand her own thoughts. He'd chosen to go at this particular time. But all right, he was a very sensible person, and by going now he'd done the right thing. It was for the best, wasn't it? "But at such a time," she muttered, and sighed deeply. "What kind of a man is he?" She loved him, it seemed, and had even become attached to him. And now, sitting there alone in her room with the windows looking like black tombstones, there was this overwhelming sense of grief. And yet at this moment, her heart was not filled with that feeling which is so essential for every marriage if it is to survive, not even when it is a marriage between beautiful, golden-haired Yelena and a cautious, ambitious general staff officer from the Baltic. A marriage with bonnets, perfumes and spurs, unencumbered by children. Nor indeed, during the entire 18 months that they had lived together, had she ever had that feeling. And so what kind of a man was he then? What exactly was it that was missing, the absence of which made her feel so empty inside? "I know what it is," said Yelena to herself. "There's no respect. You know, Seryozha, I don't respect you," she said gravely, raising her finger as she addressed the red bonnet. And horrified at what she had just said, she shuddered at the thought that she was now on her own, and wished that he were there with her. Even without that essential feeling of respect, she none the less wished he could have been with her at this difficult moment. He had gone, and her brothers had kissed him. Did they have to do that? But what am I saying, for goodness sake? What could they have done? Stopped him from going? Of course not. Perhaps, in any case, it was better that he had gone at this difficult time, and that's fine. But on no account should they have stopped him from going. On no account. Let him go if he wants to. All right, they kissed him when he left, but deep inside they hate him, for heaven's sake. You lie and lie to yourself, but as soon as you start thinking about it, you realize they hate him. Nikolka is a kind person, but his elder brother— No, that's not quite right. Alyosha is also a kind person, but he just seems to hate him more. Lord, what am I saying? And Seryozha, what am I saying about you? What if we're cut off, with you having to stay there, and me here? My husband, she said with a sigh, beginning to unbutton her housecoat. My husband. The bonnet listened to this with interest. its cheeks suffused with a deep red colour. "And what kind of a man is your husband?" it asked. "He's simply a bastard. That's all there is to it," said Alexei Turbin to himself, alone in his room across the hallway from Yelena. He had similar thoughts to Yelena, and he had spent the last few minutes in torment. "Yes, he's a bastard, but I'm a useless specimen. If I couldn't kick him out, I could at least have left the room without saying anything. But anyway, he can go to hell. He's not a bastard because he left Yelena at such a time. When all's said and done, that's just trivial rubbish. It's for quite another reason. But what then? I can see right through him, damn it. He's just a bloody puppet, lacking even the slightest concept of honour. Everything he says, whatever it is, makes him sound like a balalaika without any strings. And he's an officer, a graduate from a Russian military academy, supposed to be the finest that Russia can produce." The apartment fell silent. The strip of light emanating from Yelena's bedroom went dark. She had fallen asleep, unconscious to the world, but Alexei remained at his desk in his little room, tormented by his thoughts. The combination of vodka with German wine had disagreed with him. He sat there, looking at a page in the first book that had caught his attention, his inflamed eyes returning again and again to the same words. For a Russian, the concept of honour is merely an unnecessary burden. He got undressed and fell asleep only towards morning, and as he slept, his dream turned into a nightmare with the appearance of a little man wearing broad-checked trousers. "Best not sit on a hedgehog without any clothes," sneered the apparition. "Holy Russia is a country that's wooden, poor, and dangerous. And for a Russian, the concept of honour is merely an unnecessary burden." "To hell with you, you contemptible little man," yelled Alexei in his sleep, and still dreaming, he fumbled around in his desk drawer for his revolver, pulled it out, and chased after the apparition, attempting to shoot it. Then it vanished. He slept for the next couple of hours, a black, turbid, dreamless sleep, and then, with the timid, pale light of dawn glimmering through the veranda windows, Alexei began to dream of the city. Chapter 4. The city was alive. It steamed and roared like a multi-layered beehive, glistening in the frost and mist on the hills above the river Dnieper. Day after day, smoke curled up out of innumerable chimneys into the sky. The streets were hazy with smoke, and the gigantic mounds of fallen snow crunched underfoot. Blocks of houses rose 5, 6, 7 stories high. During the day, the windows were dark, but at night their serried ranks could be seen glowing on the dark blue surface. Electric lights shone like precious stones, perched high on curlicues on the tall lamp-posts that stretched into the distance as far as the eye could see. In the daytime, the trams, their seats padded with straw in the foreign manner, rumbled easily and smoothly along. Cabs screeched up and down the hills, and the faces of ladies, framed in the dark silver and black fur collars of their coats, seemed especially mysterious and attractive. Covered in white, virgin snow, the parks stood silent and peaceful, and there was no city in the world that had as many parks as the city. They were everywhere, huge areas with alleyways, ravines, chestnut trees, maples and limes. The beauty of the hills above the Dnieper was enhanced by many lovely parks, but the queen of them all was the immortal Imperial Park, broadening out as it climbed upwards in terraced steps, now sparkling with a million flecks of sunlight, now half hidden in gentle twilight. The rotten beams of the ancient parapet formed no barrier to the terrifying drop over the sheer cliff beneath. The steep walls of the cliff, covered with a sprinkling of snow, plunged down onto the terraces far below. Above the road that wound its way along the bank of the great river, the broad terraces in turn stretched into the distance, where they merged into the woods along the bank. The dark, ice-bound river flowed onward into the haze, continuing on to the white Dnieper rapids, the stronghold of the Zaporozhian Cossacks, the Chersonese, and on to the distant sea, out of sight even to anyone standing on the heights of the city. In winter, as in no other city in the world, Calm descended on the streets and alleyways of both the upper city on the hills as well as the lower city that was bathed in the light emanating from the frozen Dnieper. Swallowed up by the stone buildings, the roar of the traffic turned into a gentle, muffled hum. All the city's energy that had accumulated during the sunny and thundery summer had now been transformed into light. From 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the lights began to glow in the windows of the houses, in the round electric lamps, in the gas lights, in the lights of house numbers, and in the uninterrupted glass windows of the electricity stations, giving rise to thoughts of the vain and terrible electric future that awaited mankind. Through these uninterrupted glass windows, the machines with their madly, ceaselessly rotating wheels could be seen as they shook the earth's very foundation to the core. Throughout the night, the city played and danced as it glittered and glowed in the iridescent lights, until the morning, when everything was extinguished, and the city became shrouded once more in haze and mist. But outshining everything, visible from miles away, was the electric glow of the white cross held by the gigantic figure of St. Vladimir on the top of Vladimir Hill. Often in the summer, boats on the age-old Dnieper, trapped in dark mists or lost in willow thickets in the river's numerous creeks and backwaters, would see this light and be able to find their way to the city's jetties. In winter, the cross would shine in the black expanse of the heavens, casting its cold, even light on the far, gently sloping bank of the river. At this point, the river was crossed by 2 bridges. The first, Nikolaevsky Bridge, a weighty chain structure, led to the suburbs on the far bank. The other, tall and slender as an arrow, carried the trains from far, far away, from sprawling, mysterious, multifaceted Moscow. And now, in the winter of 1918, the city lived a strange, unnatural life, a life that very probably will never be repeated in the 20th century. Behind the stone walls of the buildings, every apartment was full to overflowing. Those people who had lived there for ages, the original inhabitants, had crammed and continued to cram themselves into their apartments more and more tightly, as, voluntarily or involuntarily, they admitted all the newcomers streaming into the city. All those, in fact, who had crossed the tall, slender bridge on their journey from the mysterious grey-blue haze to the east. On the run were greying bankers with their wives, talented businessmen leaving behind assistants in Moscow entrusted with the task of maintaining contact with the new world that was being created in the Muscovite kingdom, landlords leaving their houses in the care of clandestine trusted managers, industrialists, merchants, lawyers and political figures. They were joined by corrupt, greedy and cowardly journalists from both Moscow and St. Petersburg, ladies of leisure, respectable ladies from aristocratic families with their delicate daughters, pale, depraved women from St. Petersburg with scarlet-painted lips. On the run, too, were the secretaries of departmental heads, young, docile pederasts, princes and misers, poets and pawnbrokers, and policemen and actresses from the imperial theatres. All these masses of people were crowding into the city, squeezing themselves into a tiny gap. Throughout the spring, immediately after the hetman's election, the city filled up more and more with new arrivals. In the apartments, they slept on settees and chairs. Huge groups sat down to dinner in the wealthier apartments. Countless small cafes opened up, trading far into the night, with coffee and women for sale, together with new, tiny little theatres on whose boards paraded an ever-increasing number of well-known actors who had fled the 2 capitals and who were now entertaining the populace. Also opening its doors was the famous theatre The Lilac Negro, together with the magnificent nightclub on Nikolaevskaya Street, Ashes to Dust, frequented by poets, producers, actors and artists, where plates clattered until the early hours. New newspapers sprang out of nowhere, carrying sketches by some of the best writers in Russia, savaging the Bolsheviks. The whole time, every day, cabs ferried people from restaurant to restaurant, string orchestras played in cabarets, and the pale, exhausted, drug-ravaged faces of prostitutes shone through the tobacco smoke with an eerie kind of beauty. The city expanded and swelled, like leavened dough escaping from a pot. The gambling clubs were filled with the rustle of cards being played by leading figures from St. Petersburg and from the city itself, together with arrogant, self-important German lieutenants and majors whom the Russians both feared and respected. Also frequenting the gaming tables were Arabs from Moscow clubs and Ukrainian-Russian landowners, their lives already hanging by a thread. In the café, Maxim, a stocky, charming Romanian with velvety hair and wondrously sad and languorous blue eyes, soared like a nightingale on his violin. The room was lit by 2 different colours from the lamps, which were wreathed in gypsy shawls, white below and orange above and to the side. Dusty blue silk was spread like starlight across the ceiling, and large diamonds and rust-red Siberian furs glittered and glistened in the blue alcoves, and everywhere there was the smell of burnt coffee, sweat, spirits, and French perfume. Throughout the summer of 1918, the pompous cabbies in their quilted kaftans roared recklessly up and down Nikolaevskaya Street, and the rows of car headlights glowed until daybreak. In the shop windows, whole forests of flowers were displayed, smoked sturgeon hung down in slabs of golden fat, and stamps with 2-headed eagles glistened on the bottles of wonderful Abrau champagne. Throughout the summer, more and more newcomers crowded into the city. Among them were men with gristly white faces, or with a greyish stubble on their cheeks, tenor soloists with gleaming patent leather boots, members of the State Duma wearing pince-nez, and whores with resonant surnames. Billiard players escorted whores into shops to buy lipstick, women's cambric drawers with monstrous slits, and hair lacquer. Letters were sent off by the only possible loophole through troubled Poland, although incidentally nobody had any idea what sort of country this new Poland was and what was going on there, to Germany, that great country of honest Teutons, letters requesting visas and transferring money, with people sensing that maybe they would need to travel on farther, to some place where under no circumstances would there be any terrible fighting or the thunder of Bolshevik regiments on the march. People dreamt of France and of Paris, but they became depressed at the realization that getting there would be extremely difficult, maybe even impossible. And while they spent sleepless nights lying on strange settees, thinking such terrible, not always totally lucid thoughts, they were struck by an even more depressing idea. What if the steel cordon were suddenly to break and allow the grey hordes to crash through? That would be a catastrophe. Such thoughts occurred to people whenever they heard the distant, muffled thump of gunfire. All through that glittering hot summer, firing could inexplicably be heard in the vicinity of the city. Throughout the city itself, the metallic Germans were able to ensure peace and calm, but on the outskirts, the constant dull sound of gunfire was heard. The shelling took place at night, and who was firing at whom nobody knew. But during the day, people calmed down, as every so often they saw a regiment of German hussars marching along the main street, the Kreschatik, or along Vladimirskaya Street. And what regiments! Proud faces crowned by fluffy fur caps, with rock-like jaws supported by scaly leather straps and stiff ginger moustaches that pointed skywards. Squadrons of horses advanced in strict formation, powerful chestnut horses 17 hands high, and the grey-blue army jackets sat on the 600 hussars, looking like the metal uniforms adorning the massive figures of their leaders on the statues in Berlin. Everybody was so happy to see the Germans that they all calmed down. Grinning gloatingly, safe behind the protection of the barbed wire on the border, they taunted the distant Bolsheviks. "Come on then, if you dare," they shouted. They hated the Bolsheviks. But it wasn't a straightforward hatred, the kind of hatred that simply wants to fight or to kill, but a hissing, cowardly kind of hatred, a furtive, hole-in-the-corner type of hatred. They hated during the night as they fell into a vaguely troubled sleep. They hated during the day, sitting in restaurants, reading newspapers which carried descriptions of Bolsheviks shooting officers and bankers in the back of the neck, and of shopkeepers in Moscow selling horse meat infected with glanders. Everybody without exception hated. Merchants, bankers, industrialists, lawyers, actors, landlords, ladies of leisure, state council members, engineers, doctors, and writers. Then there were the officers. Officers fleeing from the former front line in the north and the west, all of them heading for the city. There were large numbers of them, and the number was growing all the time. Because they were largely penniless, and because it was impossible to disguise the fact of their profession, they were risking their lives. The most difficult thing for them was to acquire false papers, and then make their way across the frontier. They managed, however, to make their way to the city, unshaven and ridden with lice, with hunted expressions, and without their epaulets. Once in the city, they began to organize their lives so that they could find something to eat and somewhere to live. Among them were old city residents, such as Alexei Turbin, who were on their way back home from the war, returning to their familiar nests with just one thought, to rest and relax, and to start life again, not as an army officer, but as a normal human being. But there were also hundreds and hundreds of others, not from the city, who had found it impossible to remain either in St. Petersburg or in Moscow. Some of them, cuirassiers, cavalry officers, horse guards and hussars, found it easy to float to the top of the turbid foam that characterized the city during these troubled times. The hetman's bodyguard walked around with their outrageous epaulets, and up to 200 people with oily partings sat down at the hetman's tables, flashing their decaying, yellow, gold-filled teeth. Anyone who could not find a place in the hetman's bodyguard became the guest of women wearing coats with beaver fur collars and owning luxurious oak-panelled apartments in Lipki, the best part of the city, or else they found themselves a place in restaurants or hotel rooms. The other officers were staff captains from army regiments that had been disbanded, or hussars from the regular army, such as Colonel Naitur's, who had fought their way through the war. Hundreds of subalterns and second lieutenants, former students such as Stepanov Karas, their normal lives interrupted and broken by war and revolution, and other lieutenants like Viktor Viktorovich Mishlaevsky, also former students, but who would never return to their studies. On their arrival in the city, such men in their tattered grey uniforms, with their wounds still not entirely healed and their peeling epaulets, slept on chairs in their own or other people's apartments, using their greatcoats as blankets, drank vodka and dashed about the city in a frenzy of activity. And it was this group that hated the Bolsheviks with an uncomplicated and passionate hatred, the sort of hatred that can lead directly to a fight. And then there were the officer cadets. By the beginning of the revolution, there had been 4 military academies remaining in the city, an engineering academy, an artillery academy, and 2 infantry academies. All of them had stopped functioning, shattered in the crossfire between rival groups, and the cadets who had just enrolled, straight out of high school, were thrown out onto the streets, dysfunctional, neither children nor adults, neither military nor civilians, people, in fact, just like the 17-year-old Nikolka Turbin. That's all very well, of course. The hetman is in control of everything, but as God is my witness, I still don't know, and very probably will never know, what sort of person this invisible ruler really is, with a title that is more appropriate for the 17th century than the 20th. Yes, who exactly is he, Alexei Vassilievich? He's a cavalry general and a very rich landowner called Pavel Petrovich. By some strange quirk of fate and history, his election, which had taken place in the April of that famous year, had been held in a circus. Future historians will no doubt look on this as a rich source of humour. But the citizens, especially those who had settled in the city and who had already experienced the first explosive stirrings of civil war, had no time for humour, or even for any deliberations whatsoever. The election had taken place, thank goodness, with stunning rapidity. The hetman's reign had begun, and that was splendid. Just so long as meat and bread were available in the markets, there was no shooting in the streets, the Bolsheviks were kept at bay for the Lord's sake, and there were no robberies. And indeed, under the hetman, all this had more or less been achieved, even perhaps to a considerable extent. It is true that those who had fled to the city from Moscow and St. Petersburg, together with the majority of its inhabitants, laughed at the strange set-up which the hetman had created, calling it a comic opera and an unreal kingdom, like Captain Talberg. Yet their praise for the hetman was nevertheless genuine. May God grant it continue forever. But whether or not it would continue forever, nobody could say, not even the hetman himself. No, sir, not even the hetman. The fact was that the city, with its police force, military guard, ministries, regular army formations, and newspapers with various different names, was like other cities. Yet what was going on in the wider world outside the city, in the Ukraine proper, which was bigger in size than France, with a population of tens of millions of people, nobody knew. Nobody knew anything, not merely about faraway places, but absurdly about villages that were only some 30 miles away from the city itself. But although nobody knew anything, people still hated with all their heart, and when vague stories about that mysterious region, the countryside, began to circulate, stories of Germans robbing peasants and ruthlessly punishing them by shooting them with machine guns, not only was there not a single voice raised in the peasants' defence, but people sitting in their comfortable drawing rooms under silk lampshades and baring their teeth like wolves could be heard muttering, "Serves them right. Serves them right, but it's not enough. I'd be even fiercer. They'll remember the revolution all right. The Germans'll teach them. They didn't want their own people, let them try others." Yes, but that's so stupid, so stupid. What on earth do you mean, Alexei Vasilievich? They're simply scum, nothing but wild animals. The Germans will show them, and quite right too. Germans. Germans. And everywhere, Germans, Germans. Right, the Germans are here, but out there, somewhere beyond the cordon, are the grey-blue forests and the Bolsheviks. Just the two forces. Chapter 5. But then, totally unexpectedly and unforeseen, a third force appeared on the gigantic chessboard. A poor, not very clever chess player, having put in place a defensive line of pawns to ward off a threatening opponent, and by the way the Germans in their basin-like helmets are not too dissimilar to pawns, will group his other major pieces around his king. But his opponent's wily queen suddenly makes a flanking move to reach the back rank and launches an attack on his pawns and knights from the rear, placing the now very alarmed king in check. The queen in turn is followed by a rook in a dashing move up the board. The knights fly up to join the attack in a series of cunning zigzags, and the poor player is done for. His helpless king is checkmated. This all happened very quickly, but not totally unexpectedly. The ensuing events were heralded by a number of signs. One day in May, when the city had woken up to greet the morning, glittering like a pearl in turquoise, and the sun had appeared over the horizon to shine down onto the hetman's kingdom, when the city's inhabitants had already started to move about their business like ants, and the sleepy shopkeepers were beginning to open the clattering blinds in the shop windows, it was shaken by a terrible and ominous sound. Nobody had heard anything like it before. It was unlike either gunfire or thunder, but it was of such strength that many casement windows opened of their own accord, and every window shook. Then the sound was repeated, ripping through the whole of the upper city, crashing down in waves onto Podol, the lower city, then across the lovely blue Dnieper, and farther on towards the vast plains and Moscow. Citizens were woken up, and there was total confusion on the streets. It was followed instantly by people pouring down from Pyachersk, the upper city, howling and yelling, their clothes torn and covered in blood. And then the sound was heard a third time, and with such force that the windows shattered in the houses in Pyachersk, and the ground shook underfoot. Many people saw women running about in just their nightdresses and shouting wildly. People soon discovered that the sound had come from outside the city, from Bald Hill, right by the Dnieper, where there were vast warehouses containing shells and gunpowder. It was there that the explosion had taken place. For the next 5 days, the city lived in fear, expecting the influx of poisonous gases from Bald Hill. But the explosion ceased. There was no influx of gases. The people covered in blood disappeared, and all parts of the city reassumed their peaceful appearance, with the exception of one corner of Pyachersk, where a small number of houses collapsed. It goes without saying that the German High Command conducted a thorough investigation of the incident, and it goes equally without saying that the citizens remained none the wiser concerning the cause of the explosion. There were various different opinions. The explosion was the work of French spies. No, it was Bolshevik spies. The upshot of it all was that people simply forgot about it. The second sign, occurred in the summer, when the city was covered in an abundance of dusty greenery, when the thunder crashed and roared, and when the German lieutenants drank an ocean of soda water. And this second sign was genuinely monstrous. In broad daylight on Nikolaevskaya Street, just where the cabbies were waiting to ply their trade, none other than the commander-in-chief of the German army in the Ukraine, Field Marshal Eichhorn, was assassinated. Field Marshal Eichhorn, the untouchable and proud general, someone who wielded terrible power, second only to Kaiser Wilhelm himself. The assassin was a factory worker, and a socialist, of course. Within 24 hours of the death of their countryman, the Germans had hanged not only the assassin, but even the cabby who had brought him to the scene of the crime. This, it is true, did nothing to bring the famous general back to life, but it nevertheless set clever people thinking remarkable thoughts about the event. One evening, sitting with a glass of tea and lemon by the open window, struggling for breath and undoing the buttons of his linen shirt, Vasilisa was talking to Alexei in a conspiratorial whisper. "Putting all these events together, I cannot but arrive at the conclusion that our lives have become very uncertain. It seems to me that there's something unstable beneath the Germans," said Vasilisa, waving his stubby fingers in the air. "Think about it. Eichhorn, and where it all happened. Eh?" Vasilisa rolled his eyes fearfully. Alexei heard him out in gloomy silence and left the room, his cheek twitching. One more portent occurred on the very next morning, directly impacting on Vasilisa himself. Early, very early, when the first cheerful finger of sunlight appeared in the dark underground passageway leading from the yard into Vasilisa's apartment, Vasilisa looked at the ray of sun and saw a vision. She was incomparable in the bright glow of her 30 years, in the dazzle of the necklaces on her swan-like neck, in her slender bare legs and resilient, quivering breasts. The vision's teeth gleamed white, and her eyelids cast a lilac shadow onto her cheeks. 50 today, said the vision in Ukrainian in a hypnotic voice, pointing at the churn of milk. "What do you mean, Yevdokha?" whined Vasilisa. "For goodness sake, the day before yesterday it was 40, yesterday it was 45, and today it's 50. It can't go on like this." "What can I do about it?" replied the vision. "It's expensive. It's 100 at the market, it seems." Her teeth flashed once again. For an instant, Vasilisa forgot about the 50. He forgot about the 100. He forgot about everything, and he had a deliciously cool and daring feeling in the pit of his stomach. Something that he always felt whenever the beautiful vision appeared before him in the ray of sunlight. Vasilisa always rose earlier than his wife. He forgot about everything, beginning for some reason to imagine a forest glade and the scent of pine leaves. "See here, Yevdokha," Vasilisa said, licking his lips and cocking a glance to see if his wife had appeared. "You've become quite a loose woman since the revolution. But just take care. The Germans will teach you a thing or two." "Should I pat her on the shoulder or not?" Vasilisa wondered in torment, but could not bring himself to do it. A full stream of milk, the colour of alabaster, poured foaming into the jug. "Let 'em try and teach us a lesson. We'll teach them a thing or two in return," the vision suddenly replied. The gleaming churn rattled and crashed on the yoke as it rose up out of the passageway, array within array, and up into the sunlit yard. "My God, just look at her legs," groaned Vasilisa to himself. At that moment, he heard his wife's voice. Turning to look, he found himself face to face with her. "Who was that you were talking to?" his wife asked, darting a glance upwards. "Yevdokha," Vasilisa answered imperturbably. "And guess what? Milk's gone up to 50 today." "What?" shrieked Vanda Mikhailovna. "That's a scandal! The cheek of it! The peasants have gone totally mad! Yevdokha! Yevdokha!" she shouted out of the window. "Yevdokha!" But the vision had disappeared and did not return. Vasilisa looked at his wife's ugly, bent posture, her yellow hair, bony elbows, and dry, unattractive legs, and life on this earth suddenly became so intolerable that he wanted to spit at the hem of Vanda's skirt. Restraining himself with a sigh, he went back inside, into the semi-darkness, not fully understanding himself what it was that was nagging him. Maybe it was Vanda. He suddenly pictured her, with her protruding collarbones looking like the shaft of a horse's harness. Or maybe it was something awkward connected with what the ravishing vision had said. "We'll teach 'em. How do you like that, eh?" he muttered to himself. "Damn those blasted peasant markets. No, really, what would you say to that? Once they stop fearing the Germans, then that's it. We're finished. We'll teach 'em, eh? But her teeth, her magnificent teeth." For some reason, he suddenly pictured Yavdocha naked, like a witch on a mountain. The cheek of it, teach 'em indeed. But her breasts. And the thought was so disconcerting that Vasilisa suddenly felt ill, and he went off to douse himself with cold water. And so autumn crept up on them imperceptibly. The sumptuous golden summer was succeeded by a bright and dusty September, and it was in September that a real event, rather than just a sign, occurred, and at first glance it was an event of total insignificance. This is what happened. One fine September evening, a document arrived at the city prison, signed by the appropriate hetman authorities, and authorizing the release of the prisoner held in cell number 666. That was all. That was all. But oh my goodness, it was precisely and without any doubt this document that was to be the cause of such misery and disaster, so many alarums and excursions, so much bloodshed and conflagration, so many pogroms, so much despair and horror. The prisoner who had been released bore the simplest and most insignificant of names, Semyon Vasilyevich Petliura. He himself, together with the city's newspapers during the period between December 1918 and February 1919, called himself Simon, adopting somewhat the French manner. Simon's past was buried in impenetrable gloom. Some said that he was a bookkeeper. No, he was an accountant. No, he wasn't. He was a student. On the corner of Nikolaevskaya Street and the Khreshchatyk stood a large, fashionable tobacco shop. On a long sign above the shop hung an exceedingly fine representation of a Turk in a fez smoking a hookah. The Turk was depicted wearing a pair of soft yellow slippers with upturned toes. There were some who could be found who attested to the fact that they had recently seen Simon in this very same shop, elegantly serving behind the counter, selling tobacco goods that had been produced in Solomon Cohen's factory. But there were others who maintained that it was nothing of the sort, and that he was the official representative of the Union of Municipalities. No, not the Union of Municipalities, but the Rural Assembly, replied a third group. A typical rural hussar. Yet a fourth group of people, visitors from elsewhere, closed their eyes in concentration and muttered, "Just hold on a moment, if you please." And they began to tell everyone how they'd seen him one evening in Moscow, walking along Malaya Bronaya Street. It must have been 11 years ago. He was carrying a guitar under his arm, wrapped in black calico. And they even added that the reason he was carrying a guitar was because he was going to a party of fellow nationals from the Ukraine. Yes, that's right. He was on his way to a lively party with a group of red-cheeked, fun-loving Ukrainian girl students, with plum brandy direct from the bountiful Ukraine, and songs, including the song about the marvellous Grisha. No, please, don't go. Then their account began to lose its way, with dates, places, and descriptions of his appearance becoming confused. Clean-shaven, you say? No, just a moment. He had a beard, I think. But hold on, he wasn't from Moscow, surely, was he? No, he was just a student there. He was... Nothing of the sort. Ivan Ivanovich knows him. He was a village school teacher in Tarashcha. Damn it, maybe it wasn't Bronaya Street he'd been walking along. Moscow is a large city. Bronaya is often foggy and dark, and there can be hoarfrost there. A guitar, a sunlit Turk, a hookah, the guitar twanging away. Foggy, can't see much. Oh my God, it's so foggy. Like a nightmare. The guards' cadets sing. Blood-stained shadows, ghosts flitting past, young girls with their plaits flying in the wind, prisons, gunshots, frost, and the cross of St. Vladimir shining at midnight. The Guards' cadets sing as down the street they pound, the trumpets and drums and the cymbals resound. Cymbals crashing, bullets whistling like nightingales, men being beaten to death with ramrods, black horsemen on the march on their fiery steeds. The prophetic dream crashes up to Alexei Turbin's bed as he lies asleep, his face pale in the pink glow of the lamplight, a damp lock of hair plastered to his hot forehead. The whole house is asleep. From the library comes the sound of Karas snoring, and from Nikolka's room of Chervinsky's whistling breath. Dark. Night. On the floor by Alexei's bed, a copy of Dostoevsky's The Devils lies open, filling the room with the sound of mocking, desperate voices. Elena is quietly asleep. Well, here's what I think. There was no such person. This Simon never existed. None of it existed. Neither the Turk, nor the guitar in the lamplight on Bronaya Street, nor the rural assembly. Not a sausage. It's all simply a myth, concocted in the Ukraine, in the fog of that terrible year 1918. And there was something else as well. Sheer, undiluted hatred. The Germans numbered 400,000 men, but around them were 160 times that number of Ukrainian peasants, their hearts burning with an unquenchable feeling of malice. Oh yes, so much had been accumulating in their hearts, the lash of lieutenants' whips on their cheeks, the random shelling of recalcitrant villages, backs crisscrossed with stripes from ramrods wielded by hetmanite Cossacks, and receipts written on torn pieces of paper by German majors and lieutenants. To a Russian sow for the purchase of 1 pig, 25 marks. All those appearing at army headquarters in the city, bearing such receipts, were greeted by loud, scornful laughter. And then there were the requisitioned horses, the pilfered bread, the fat-faced landowners returning to their estates under the hetman, and the spasm of hatred at the very mention of the word officers. Yes, sir, that's how it was. Then there were the rumours of land reform that the hetman was planning to carry out. But alas, it was only in November 1918, when the guns were already thundering on the outskirts of the city, that clever people such as Vasilisa realized that the peasants hated this hetman as if he were a rabid dog, considering such a dastardly plan to be totally unnecessary. Instead, what they needed was the age-old, longed-for peasants' reform. All land to the peasants, 300 acres per man, the total abolition of landlords. The assignment of each 100 acres to be accompanied by a stamped official title deed attesting to the permanent entitlement of the land to be handed down from grandfather to father, father to son, son to grandson, and so on. No crook to come from the city to requisition grain. The grain belongs to us, and no one else can have it. What we can't eat, we'll bury in the ground. The city to keep us supplied with kerosene. But then, sir, no hetman, however respected, or anyone else for that matter, could ever have carried out reforms of that nature. There were some melancholy rumours flying around that only the Bolsheviks could deal with a disastrous situation such as the one created by the hetman and the Germans. But the Bolsheviks were no better. Nothing but a bunch of yids and commissars. The Ukrainian peasants are in a pretty miserable situation, nowhere to look to for any salvation. Scores of thousands of people had returned from the front line, knowing how to shoot, having been taught how to do so on the orders of the High Command. Buried in the ground and hidden in haylofts and barns were hundreds of thousands of rifles that had not been handed in, despite hastily set up German military field tribunals, whippings with ramrods, and shootings. Along with the rifles, millions of rounds of ammunition were buried. In every 5th village there were 3-inch guns, and machine guns in every 2nd, and each little town had its warehouses full of shells, and its stores of greatcoats and fur caps. And in these same little towns there were school teachers, medical orderlies, smallholders, Ukrainian seminarists who by a twist of fate had become army subalterns, burly beekeepers' sons and staff captains with Ukrainian surnames, all speaking Ukrainian, all carrying in their heart the idea of a magical, imaginary Ukraine that was without landowners or those bloody Muscovite officers. In addition, there were thousands of Ukrainian prisoners of war who had returned from captivity in Galicia. Then, on top of this, the tens of thousands of peasants. Oh my God. Then there was this prisoner, the guitar, beset by rumours, terrible rumours. Hey, Nikolka, that's right, twang away. The Turk, the rural hussar Simon. Ah, but he didn't exist, did he? So it was all nonsense, legend, a mere mirage. And that notorious November, it was pointless for clever Vasilisa to clutch at his head and exclaim, Quos vult perdere dementat, and to curse the hetman for releasing Petliura from that foul city prison. It's all nonsense. If it's not him, then it'll be someone else. If not, then someone else again. And so all the signs ceased, to be replaced by the onset of real events. The second real event wasn't a trivial matter such as the release of some mythical person from prison. Oh no, this one was of such import that mankind will doubtless speak of it for 100 years to come. In far-off Western Europe, the Gallic cockerels in their red trousers pecked the thick-set, steel-clad Germans to within an inch of their lives. It was a terrible sight to see these cockerels in their Phrygian caps bearing down on the armour-plated Teutons with guttural screams and ripping out pieces of flesh and armour. The Germans fought back desperately, gritting their teeth and thrusting their broad bayonets into the feathered breasts of their opponents, but they were unable to hold out, and the Germans begged for mercy. The next event was closely linked with this, and flowed from it as a direct consequence. The whole world, now stunned and shaken by what had happened, learnt that the man whose name and handlebar moustache, the size of 6-inch nails, were familiar to everyone, and whose body was probably fashioned entirely from metal, with no sign of any wood, had been deposed. Turned into dust, he ceased to be emperor. Then, when everyone in the city saw for themselves the colour fade from the German lieutenants, and the shining nap of their grey-blue uniforms become the colour of drab matting, a shiver of dread ran through them all like a whirlwind. And this happened there and then, in front of their very eyes, in the course of a few hours. And within just a few hours, the light in the lieutenant's monocled eyes faded, and then disappeared altogether, leaving nothing but a look of poverty-stricken despair. Then it was as if an electric current flowed through the minds of the brighter of those people who, with their solid yellowing suitcases and their plump wives, had leapt across the barbed wire of the Bolshevik encampment and made their way to the city. They realized that their fate was now linked with a vanquished nation, and their hearts were filled with horror. "The Germans have been beaten," said the snakes. "We have been beaten," said the clever snakes. The city's inhabitants realized this as well. Ah, yes, but only those who have been beaten know the real meaning of the word. It is like night-time in a house without electric light. It is like a room in which a green mould infested with harmful germs is creeping down the wallpaper. It is like demon children with rickets, or rancid cooking oil, or women using foul language in the dark. In short, it is like death.